This past March, at the beginning of the widespread recognition of coronavirus, an article appeared in Forbes magazine that had this story in it. Years ago, the anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked by a student what she considered to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. The student expected Mead to talk about clay pots or tools for hunting, grinding stones, religious artifacts. But no. Mead said that the first evidence of civilization was a 15,000-year-old fractured femur found in an archaeological site. A femur is the longest bone in the body, linking hip to knee. In societies without the benefit of modern medicine, it takes about 6 weeks of rest for a fractured femur to heal. This particular bone had been broken and had healed. Mead explained that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You cannot run from danger. You cannot drink or hunt for food. Wounded in this way, you are meat for your predators. No creature survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. You are eaten first. A broken femur that has healed is evidence that another person has taken time to stay with the fallen, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended them through recovery. A healed femur indicates that someone has helped a fellow human rather than abandoning them to save their own life. Helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts, Margaret Mead said. And then it ends with the quote that we all know from her. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can't change the world, for indeed, that's all who ever have. So this account reminds us immediately of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? But the version Jesus gave us wasn't just about taking care of someone in trouble. Jesus amped up the story by making the caregiver a Samaritan. Today, of course, Samaritan is synonymous with caregiver, as in Samaritan House or Good Samaritan Hospital, but not so in the first century. Back then, to the Judeans who first heard this story, the Samaritans were another group entirely. The Samaritans traced their lineage to the old northern kingdom, to the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who were actually Joseph's sons. Their worship was centered on Mount Gerizim, north of Jerusalem, rather than on Jerusalem itself. They were ancient siblings who now worshiped differently. Big uh-oh. And they were viewed with hostility by the Judeans. Samaritans were the other with a capital O. If you were going to rewrite this story in the modern era, you might make the man who got robbed and the Samaritan Catholic and Protestant in Northern Ireland, right? Ancient siblings who worship differently and they hate each other's guts. You might make them Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda in the 90s. Oy. You might make them Jew and Muslim in Israel today. Other with a capital O is so often a neighbor or a distant relative, someone you might have been friends with had circumstances been different. As it is, you are mortal enemies, which makes caregiving across that boundary a startling act, a counterintuitive act, a very Jesus-like act. In fact, in the Jesus Seminar's color-coded New Testament, the parable of the Good Samaritan rates a solid red, definitely the words of Jesus. They write, as a metaphorical tale that redraws the map of both the social and the sacred world. The seminar regarded this parable as a classic example of the provocative public speech of Jesus. Classic Jesus, basically saying, listen to me, we can move past the old tribal mentality. We can do better than that. We are all God's children. That's a pretty provocative idea. It's provocative even today. We had a great example of the other with a capital O right at College Heights a few years ago. Some of you were there. Remember the morning we had our very first racism discussion? It turned out to be Raj's first Sunday as our pastor. He and Bonnie were both there. And I remember he was a little worried that we were starting in on this very highly charged area of racism. And I remember saying, don't worry, this is College Heights, it'll be fine. So we went ahead with it. And because when you have a discussion about racism, you need to understand where the participants are coming from, what their backgrounds are. It took us the whole time, the hour plus, to go around the table, and each person needed to answer 3 questions. What part of the country did you grow up in? What did your parents teach you about race? And tell one brief story about your awakening to racism as an issue. Because of course, kids think everything's fine, and then at some point usually in their early teens, something happens that makes them realize that. So we're going around the table and we're getting kind of the expected results, Helena's mother grew up in the South, right? And so they had Black servants in her house as she was growing up. And those were the stories she told Helena. So that, colors your growing up years. Jim Garrison grew up right in San Mateo. So kind of a different orientation. And, I love great stories. And then we get to Al Hassi. Al is usually so quiet. He's just sitting there in the background and, right, taking it all in. But that morning he said, I think I get this. I think I pretty much have the quote right. He said, I grew up in Wisconsin in a German Lutheran dairy town. There were no people of color in my town. So we were taught to look down on the Catholics and the wrong kind of Lutheran. I think my jaw must have just dropped. I just had this flash that, oh my God, racism is like way bigger than just we need to clean up our history of oppression of the descendants of the slaves in this country. That's like where we're starting. But even after we clean up all of that and the reparations and get past it, apparently we still have this problem that if you don't have skin tone as a way to discriminate between people, you will find something else. The wrong kind of Lutheran. I presume that means like Missouri Synod instead of ELCA or something like that. Ancient siblings who worship differently. Oh my gosh. Oh dear. Oh. Ugh. The other is a very large problem. That makes Jesus casting the caregiver as a Samaritan is huge in this story. So I did an interesting exercise for myself. This is just me. You have to do your own version of it. I asked myself, who is other with a capital O to me today? To really qualify it as other, it has to be someone who just is sort of, just evokes feelings of, like I can't go there. I just, almost a repulsion. sort of, but at a reflex level, like you can't even stop yourself. So, I'm thinking about all these pots. No, that's fine. I got, no, that does, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, it hit me. I know who it is. She's a woman who actually looks like me, maybe 20 years younger, but basically looks like me. And we've all seen her in the news. She's got her face contorted by a scream of rage and hate. And she's got a red MAGA hat on and no mask in sight. And she's carrying a sign that says something like, Jesus didn't believe in vaccines. I look at that and I don't even know where to start. I mean, there go not just my politics, but my religion and my science. And it's like she's living in some other reality. And there's no connection. I don't even know how I would begin a conversation to find commonalities. That division, that lack of commonality for someone who in other circumstances might be friends, right? It's scary to me. It feels like things are breaking down. And there are folks who emphasize the breaking down and imagine terrible things into the future. But there is also the view that things need to break down before you can fix what's broken. It's sort of like when you're restoring an old house, if you've got problems in the foundation, you got to go under the house and clean that up first. You got to replace the beams that are termite infested before you bother to restore the house, because otherwise, what's the point? It's going to fall down if you don't fix the foundation. So then I asked, well, how do you go into the basement and clean out and build a new and better civilization? And I go back to that story about Margaret Mead. I think you build a new and better civilization the way you built one in the first place, one mended femur at a time. I think back on the last 5 or 6 weeks and the people that have come to be our guest preachers. Each of them in their own way, mending femurs where they are. Becca Bach from Carson City with her training police for crisis intervention. And Jane Buckley Farley in Minneapolis creating interfaith space in her neighborhood. And Terry, our own Terry Jackson, the model of rule by law, which is the thing we all hold on to now, as this is going to save us. And she's upholding it every day that she goes to work. Chief Ed Barberini from San Mateo, actually open to ways of helping his police force deal with stress with resilience. Did you see the write-up in the Daily Journal this last week? He's on the front page. Little picture of Ed. And he talks about this program in the works for resilience training for his police officers. That's Mo's project. All right, we're going to do this. And then Rita Mancera last week, who's so busy helping the fire evacuated farm workers, Sammy had to remind her to zoom into church. I mean, these are all people tending femurs right where they are with the skills and the aptitude that they have and reaching out to people who need what they have to offer. And in that reaching out, we can cross the boundary to the other. So I'm going to close with my favorite example of how this can work in real life. This actually comes from a film that Suzanne and I saw at Holden Village one summer many years ago. So it was a film taken kind of like home movies by a Lutheran missionary who was back from Rwanda after the genocide. The genocide happened in 1994 when, in the space of 100 days, Hutu extremists killed somewhere around 1 million people. They killed Tutsis, any Tutsi they could find, and they killed Hutu moderates, members of their own tribe, which is what extremists do. So the missionary was there in the aftermath of this genocide, and he had visited a village that was run by women. That's because all the able-bodied men from that village were dead. All the village had were women and old men and children. The women had formed a council made up, they were both, they'd formed a council, and they planned planting their crops and harvesting the crops, and the council settled disputes, and they basically created some order out of this chaos after the genocide. The thing was, there were both Hutus and Tutsis in this village, and there were both Hutus and Tutsis on the council. The women had found a way to work together. In fact, the council's name, which was long and multisyllabic in their language, translated to women who stand together and like each other. What motivated them to get past the boundary of the other? They all had babies. It was more important to feed the children than it was to perpetuate the old enmities. And once they'd worked together, they discovered they liked each other, and poof, the boundary, the other, just disappeared. Somehow, in this country, we have to find a way to work together with those we think of as other. The current administration has ripped away the illusion of one America and exposed some pretty ugly boundaries and divisions. Somehow we will have to reach across those boundaries and find the commonalities that are more important than the differences. I don't know exactly how it will happen, but I do know that it can't be done from a stance of hate. Hate doesn't make for strong foundations. And you can't conquer the hate coming at you with more hate. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that.